Today we're doing section 4.8, day 2, and we're going to discuss the inverse of the tangent function. So the tangent function is the hardest of the three to remember because if you're looking at the unit circle or if you're thinking about your coordinates, it's not just all spelled out like it normally is, meaning you have to kind of calculate y divided by x in your head to figure out the coordinates. Tangent is similar to sine in the fact that it goes from negative pi over 2 to a positive pi over 2. So we're going to go ahead and set up our table. So negative pi over 4, then negative pi over 6, 0, and then we go the positive direction. So positive pi over 6, positive pi over 4, pi over 3, and pi over 2. So definitely helps to have your unit circle handy, just to kind of visually look at the coordinates, and we can also discuss them. So for negative pi over 2, the coordinate for negative pi over 2 is 0, negative 1, and when I do y divided by x, I get undefined. For negative pi over 3, the coordinate is 1/2 and a negative root 3 over 2. So when I do y divided by x, I get negative root 3. For negative pi over 4, it's a root 2 over 2, negative root 2 over 2. So I'll get negative 1. Negative pi over 6 is a root 3 over 2 and a negative 1/2. So when I do y divided by x, I get negative root 3 over 3. The coordinate for 0 is 1, 0, and when I do y divided by x, I get 0. And the values are just the same for the remaining ones, they're just now positive. So again, today we'll use the chart, but then tomorrow in class we're going to try and phase the chart out, and then you have to do this from memory. So for the first example, it says 1 is the inverse of tangent equal to root 3. So the answer would be pi over 3. The examples at the bottom of the page are the composition of different functions. So notice sometimes it says inverse, sometimes it doesn't. So for this inside function, it is not the inverse. They're giving you an angle. We need to find the answer. So the coordinate for, 3 pi over 2 is a 0, negative 1. And I know sine is the y value of the coordinate. So now I have sine of negative 1, which means inverse, and that result becomes negative 1. And now we're using the inverse function, so I need to figure out, well, why is sine equal to negative 1? And that would be in the same location, but the only thing that would be different is that, remember, your bank for sine is negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. So the angle would be a negative pi over 2. For letter B, I had tangent of a negative pi over 6. So the coordinate is root 3 over 2 and a negative 1/2. And I know tangent is y over x. So when I do y divided by x, I'll get negative root 3 over 3. And then negative root 3 over 3 for tangent gives me the angle of negative pi over 6. And then lastly, letter C. So 4 pi over 3 is in quadrant 2. So x is negative, y is positive in quadrant 2. And I know that cosine is the x value, so this is negative 1/2. Then to find the inverse, because it's 1/2, I know that it comes from a denominator of 3, but cosine, the bank, is from 0 to pi. So my angle will have to be 2 pi over 3. So that's all for this lesson. Again, it's really important just to memorize for the three trig functions, what are the possible answers, meaning like what can they range from. And as long as you have that memorized, you should be pretty okay with this. So we'll go over this material tomorrow.